Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 321 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on what are social graces within clinical psychology. And it's Sunday the 5th of May 2025 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is going to be really good and really brilliant because social graces is one of those topics that I've personally struggled with quite a lot to understand it, because in my lectures, in the textbooks that I've read, it's always just been overlooked, and it's always just been like, yes, social graces exist, but we aren't going to focus on it too much. So I really wanted to explore social graces in a lot more depth. And in essence, what they are is that it's a framework to get us talking about the different aspects of our social identities and how these could impact our clinical practice, but also how it can impact our clients' lives. So it's really important to look into from a social justice point of view, but also more just out of curiosity and thinking about where do our own opinions come from as psychological practitioners. So by the end of today's podcast episode, you'll understand what are social graces, why are they important, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of the social graces framework. So really useful podcast episode coming up in the content part. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're going to be reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is focusing on their podcast. So PsychCrunch, episode 40, Kink, Community and Transformation. The massive variety of human sexual interest is a little mind-boggling, as what we might consider to be sexually typical continues to be expanded and shaped by the internet and popular culture. Psychologists are making efforts to research and understand kinks and members of the kink community like never before. In the latest episode of PsychCrunch, join Ella Host in a conversation with Liam Wigner, senior lecturer at Brighton University and a committee member of the BPS's sexuality section, and his work exploring a community in these underground spaces, neurodivergence in kink, and the ways modern technology is transforming the scene, as well as research into it. And we also chat with Dr. Kate Marks, a clinical psychologist who works with those in kink communities about her impressions of the emotions, social consequences, and even therapeutic echoes that run through these subversive engagements. So whilst there's not a lot that I can personally say about this topic, I'm very inexperienced about basically everything when it comes to relationships, sex and kink. What I do think is interesting is that it's certainly a lot more common than people actually want to acknowledge it. So that's the first point that I would want to make. And I don't think that this is because traditionally kink is seen as a very taboo topic, as is sex and relationships as a whole, which does have a whole knock-on effect, which I talk about in different places and different books that are coming up, because the issue, or one of the many issues, with the idea that we don't talk about sex, so we don't talk about relationships, so we don't talk about consent, and we also don't teach what consent actually is, because all of that, the information that we give children is that consent is yes and no, when in reality consent is so much more than that, is that we don't give young people with the actual knowledge to be able to have healthy, consensual relationships. And I always think that this is partly where when a kink comes in there, where like kink does require a lot of trust, confidence, and you being able to look after the like other person. But because we don't have these conversations, these open, healthy conversations, then we're actually just harming our young people and other people who will want to engage in sex. Because like, we don't teach them about aftercare. We don't teach them about consent and how to do this all healthy and safely. So that's definitely like one angle. So it's a lot more common, and society is failing young people in terms of sexual education because we just don't talk about this stuff. And I also want to talk about the therapeutic echoes that run through these subversive egg experiences. That's a very interesting point because I know that for some people, like this is from what I've heard and what I've read from different people, is that sometimes, especially if we look at the most typical egg example of domination and submission, the interesting thing about that is that some people just want to let go. They don't want to make decisions. They just want to be told what to do just so they can relax. And for them, that's relaxing, that's escapism. It's just where they can just be someone else for like a few hours and they can just escape from all their responsibility and the pressure of the outside world though. And the therapeutic echoes is very good to think about because isn't that essentially what we do in therapy? We give people a chance to escape from the pressure of everyday life. For example, if the client needs to be this stronger person who can never show emotion, they can never buckle because they live in a high stress job and they've got so much responsibility and so many people depend on them. Well, to some extent, that's what we do with our therapy sessions. We give them a chance to escape, become someone else, and show different sides of themselves. So I know there are other echoes too, but I just want to get us thinking about that kink. We should be able to talk about it a lot more. We should be able to teach others how to do it safely and essentially, and we should just stop the stigma. Just because you don't want to do it in the bedroom or wherever the underground scene is, doesn't mean that we should stop other people from doing it too. As long as it's legal, safe, and consensual, of course. Moving on to the next one. The second one is anxiety makes us more welcoming of gossip. How do we evaluate gossipers from our own social circle differently to those outside of them? And how do our own traits temper our reaction towards those who gossip? These are questions posed by Brodie Patton and another researcher from Royal Holloway, University of London. In their latest paper, they find that people like and evaluate those who share negative gossip less favourably than non-gossipers, regardless of whether or not they're a friend. Surprisingly, however, the results show that people with high levels of anxiety evaluate gossipers more positively than those who aren't socially anxious. Oh, okay, now that is a good finding, and one that does have quite a few implications. So, first of all, I definitely understand those are people who share negative gossip are evaluated less positively than gossipers, because if you share negative stuff, then especially if it hurts the person though that you're telling, then that's not good. That is not going to put you in good light. Equally, if you're sharing people's secrets and if they're bad secrets, then again that does not put you in a good light because Why are you sharing that stuff about someone? That's not good. But equally, because I used to have very high levels of social anxiety, I completely understand the next finding because I really do like gossip. In fact, most of my family does. Pretty sure I'm the only one with any form of a social anxiety. And I don't know why I like gossip. I think it's just some. I think I just like the idea of it's a secret. It's more information because going back to my trauma background, the more information you have, the more you can predict people, the more you can decide if someone is safe or not. So those sort of aspects. So I would have to read the a paper more to find out why specifically social anxiety makes you more likely to welcome and gossip. But I think there were definitely a lot of factors. Factors though. So maybe at the end of this Psychology News article, think about what do you think of gossipers? How do you react to a gossip? So the first one is panic buying really panic? Some of the most striking early images to come out of the early pandemic period were those of empty supermarket shelves, or people leaving the shops with trolleys piled high with excesses of toilet paper, bags of ice, or bottled water. The discourse around this placed the blame on individuals who were seen as at fault for irrational so called panic buying. Whether or not these behaviours were actually motivated by the irrationality we usually associate with panic, however, is an important question. If scientists and the general public alike erroneously think of panic buying as something akin to herd mentality or uncritical contagion, we risk losing vital insights into what actually drives this disruptive behaviour, as well as opportunities to better mitigate it in the future. This problem is at the centre of new research conducted by a team from the UK and Chile, published recently in PLO1. Analysing in-depth conversations about those with experience of panic buying, Angelus Notaris and her colleagues pull out three key themes which characterise the behaviour, ultimately concluding that describing it as panicked fails to capture the psychological egg experience that drives the people to stock up in a crisis. So, first of all, I just want to say that it was ridiculous early in the pandemic because that so called panic buying was just, I could not understand it myself. But I also know that the bandwagon effect was in there because people did just sort of want to go on to the bandwagon, which was interesting. But something else that I want to mention is that if I really think about it now, I sort of see where the researchers are coming from. Because if you're panicked, if you're really scared, if you are very nervous about your survival, which in terms of this panic, then you cannot be rational whatsoever. And if you're very irrational, which is what this is in applying, then I don't think that it is irrational to go out because this is like a multi-step process, and yeah, and this isn't a spur of the moment thing because you need to decide to go to the shops. You need to get ready to go to the shops. You need to drive or get to the shops. You need to walk in. You need to find the toilet paper. You need to put it in. You need to pay for it, etc., etc. So there's actually a multi-step process here. So you can't do this very quickly. And at any one of these steps, you could actually go, oh, I'm making a big mistake. So I understand that that this does sound very irrational. And on some level, saving up on toilet paper is definitely irrational to stock up on toilet paper, especially when there are more survival based things which you could buy, like canned food, fuel, stuff to cook on, and those sort of like things that were like water purification, etc. So I understand that aspect. But because it's a mostly set process, and you also don't see people doing the physiological things, which is associated with a panic. Panic, though, like people weren't randomly running into shops, they weren't pushing, kicking, screaming, trying to get the last toilet roll. This was actually done quite organised. I think to call it panicked, I think is wrong now that I actually come to question it. So it's really good that there is research trying to like correct it. But I think that the next challenge is once we've verified these findings and this becomes part of the core literature, how do we change people's minds? How do we get people to acknowledge that this is not actually panic buying, this is something else buying though, because this is the issue now. Because like we've seen the myths and the misconceptions about the MMR vaccine so-called causing autism. We know scientifically that is not true whatsoever, but because it's been populated in the population and in society, there are still tons of people who believe it. And we know that the measles cases are increasing year on year, and at some point there will be a major measles outbreak because we're losing our herd immunity. So, how do we get people to overcome this myth and this misconception? So, that is the next step. So, I hope you enjoy the psychology news section. So, let's move on to the personal update. So, this week has been so much revision, and I completely admit that when you've got a lot of revision to do and you work 4 6-hour days and you do lots of other projects on the side, you can get quite exhausted. But this week has been a lot of fun because I've been doing the Da Vinci days at my university. So this involves working with like 111-year-olds and 12-year-old students a day to build bridges out of straws and other bits. And there's like scavenger hunts and other bits and pieces to them. So it was a lot of fun. I knew so many other students because I do reading support at one of the schools that came down. So every day I was saying hello to like 10, 20 kids because they just knew me instantly. And they were asking about me. Yeah, and they were really, really happy. And it was nice. Nice though. And then I've also applied for another postgraduate job, which I'm quite looking forward to though, because it's an educational mental health practitioner job, which definitely got me thinking because my outreach work, so being a student ambassador, my university's outreach and widening participation department, it really has helped me over the past 6 years because I've been able to develop a lot of skills. I've been able to work a lot with students and young people. Some of them have different mental health conditions like social anxiety, autism, dyslexia, and a whole bunch of other ones. And then this also given me presentation skills, communication skills, leadership skills, and a whole bunch of other useful skills too. And if you'd asked me a few months ago, would I even be considering working in education for a job, I would have said no. I was just not interested in it. But now, because when I'm looking at the work experience requirement, the education ones are really good, and I tend to be overqualified for some of the education roles because I've been working with the children for 6 years, so I'm really happy about that. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because your psychology journey really can go in very unexpected directions and directions that you never would have considered originally. So I'm looking forward to it. I really, really want this job that I applied for because it's in a apprenticeship which would really suit me. And then I've also been doing a lot of revision this week for my neuropsychology of aging exam, which is in 3 days. So it's the one and only exam that I have. I'm feeling quite confident in it now because I've been doing a lot of revision and I've been doing lots of writing and other bits and pieces, including some YouTube shorts. And after that exam's done, that will basically be the vast majority of my time at university over, because I'll just have to touch up my dissertation, and then that will be it, which is surprising. And I'm definitely starting to notice that I'm not going to see tons of people ever again, like the ambassadors who I was working with like last week. The majority of them I might never see again, which is heartbreaking because I really like them. I love my outreach work. They're brilliant. And yeah, so a lot is changing. My psychology journey is definitely ending, but then it's going to start up again with me working and having a job, hopefully. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment out of the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley, or leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. So I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And please send the pictures of where you're listening in from. I always love to see where all of you are all over the world. And today's episode has been sponsored by Moral Psychology, an introduction to the social psychology, biological psychology, and applied psychology of morality. So this is a great sponsor for today's episode because morality and social graces does sort of overlap, because morality gets us to think about what drives our actions, whether good and like morally right, but also if they're morally wrong though, and morality is a social construct, and social graces addresses a lot of the social factors and the social aspect of our identities, so there is some overlap. And another key part of social graces is actually reflecting on our actions about whether we can be fairer, more thoughtful, more effective in the future. So by reflecting on our social graces, we are actually striving to be more moral, because we're trying to be fairer in the future by calling out and identifying our own implicit biases because of our social factors. So there's a massive overlap between social graces and moral psychology. So I really do recommend it. It's a great, really easy to understand book that will really help you to understand what is the morality, what are the social bases of morality, also a biological basis, and how does developmental psychology impact our morality too. And this book has lots of applied aspects too, but because throughout the book we do constantly look at morality through a real world lens. So it's a brilliant book that I highly recommend. So that is Moral Psychology, Introduction to the Social Psychology, Biological Psychology and Applied Psychology of Morality. Available at all major ebook retailers. You can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, local bookstore or local library if you request it. And if you want the AI-generated audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, then now you can, at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Baker & Taylor, Biblioteca and Overdrive. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons, as your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. So if you want to become a patron of the show and to get access to tons of great rewards, then now you can, including lots of exclusive blog posts, follows, which will not be made into podcast episodes for weeks, months, or even years in the future. So you can become a patron of the show by heading on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to show the podcast a bit of one-time support, then now you can. buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So that's enough for the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what social graces in psychology. It's a great episode, so let's dive into it. What are social graces? So, social graces is an acronym that helps us to understand the visible and invisible aspects of our identity. So, this allows mental health practitioners to examine the elements of our identity that impact our behaviour and lives. And this is what each letter of the graces in social graces means. G. Gender, generation, geography, and gender identity. R. Race and religion. A. Age, appearance and ability. C. Culture, caste, and class. E. Education, economics and ethnicity. S. Sexuality, sexual orientation, and spirituality. In addition, Social Graces is a framework designed by Burnham 1993 and updated in 2012 that asks mental health practitioners to be aware of how their identity influences their thinking and approach to work, since Social Graces focus on how different aspects of our identity impact our practice. Some academic definitions of social graces include, open quote, a mnemonic that separates out different aspects of identity into separate categories, close the quote. Butler 2017, page 17. Open quote, mnemonic for different aspects of difference, close the quote. Jones and Reeve 2014, page 2. Open quote. A suitable framework through which therapists can reflect on their own belief and prejudices in order to understand how they might bring these into the therapy. Close quote. To Sucker, 2014, page 106. Therefore, some quick examples of how thinking about social graces can impact clinical practice is that if you're a young and beautiful young woman, so that's age, appearance, and gender, how might these social factors impact your clinical practice compared to a middle-aged woman with an average appearance? The middle-aged woman would likely have more clinical experience than the younger woman, yet the younger woman would probably be treated better and have advantages because of her youth and attractive appearance. Yet both women, because of their gender, would be unlikely to face one or two gender stereotypes compared to male therapists, due to the myth in society that women are more sensitive, caring, and better therapists than men. On the other hand, men would have a lot of the benefits compared to women because of the patriarchal society that we live in. Personally, if I look at myself briefly, I am a young 24-year-old white non-binary person who was assigned male at birth, and I look male in appearance. I'm from a middle-class background, I'm gay, and in terms of my sexuality, I'm not very active and I've only ever had one relationship. All these different social factors will impact my clinical practice in different ways. For example, whilst I'm aware of lots of different social issues, particularly those that are faced by people from lower socio-economic backgrounds, I will never be able to fully understand the impact because I have not lived through them myself because of my class. Also, when I work with heterosexual clients. Again, I have a great awareness of heterosexual relationships, but because I'm gay and I've only ever had one relationship, my understanding will still be limited. However, because of biological sex and appearance, I get a lot of male privilege that other clients and practitioners don't get, and I'll be able to help and support autistic, LGBT plus and trauma survivors a lot in my clinical practice because I've lived those egg experiences too. What is the purpose of social graces? The social graces framework is useful because it allows psychologists, counselors, educators, and therapists to talk about aspects of our identity and how they might impact how we relate to other people. Therefore, it's designed to make identity factors a part of our clinical discussions about our personal privileges and disadvantages that we face in society. This includes our own implicit biases, because once our biases are identified, we can help neutralize them so that we can become more thoughtful, fair, and effective practitioners. Notel 2017, page 4 mentioned, open quote, provides a helpful way for us to become intentional in our developing awareness of, reflexivity about, and skillfulness in responding to sameness and difference. Close quote. Because I want to lead by example here, I know I can sometimes be biased against different classes, which is weird because I come from a very, very deprived area. Therefore, as I make myself aware of my class's attitudes, I'm able to catch myself and stop the thought and biased attitude in its tracks. Furthermore, Partridge and McCarry 2017 argue that the framework can help psychologists use our reflections to inform our future actions, so it gets us to think about how we can ensure that we are fairer in the future. Social graces can help us to reflect on our actions in the first place, so we can think about how our identity influenced the situation, and social graces allow us to subvert the dominant discourse. This nerve psychologist considering how to rethink ongoing behaviours that give privilege to dominant social identities, like white, male, middle class, able individuals. Lastly, social graces allow us to consider new or alternatives for future actions so we can come up with new ways to behave that are fairer. Going back to my classism example, when I find that I'm being classist against someone or a group of people, then this is me reflecting on my action and realizing that this is my own class that is making me behave this way. Therefore, in future, I need to make sure that I'm fairer and I need to subvert the dominant discourse. This is one of the many reasons why I love my outreach work. So every week I get to work with students and young people from deprived areas and help them realize that university is a great and achievable option for them if they want to go. This helps rebalance the social skills so university isn't reserved for dominant social identities and anyone can go, regardless of their age, race, gender, socio-economic status, and more. What are the key features of social graces? Firstly, all aspects of our identity are equally important to the social graces framework. Burnham, 2003, proposed that all aspects of our identity should be considered equally important, as whilst gender, geography, and generation come before race and religion in the framework, this does not mean they are more important. Each of the graces are meant to be examined individually without being drowned out by any of the others. Secondly, the social graces framework is always evolving as people will naturally add and subtract from it. Since psychologists can use the framework practically by starting a therapy session by asking people what other aspects of identity they could add to the framework. For instance, if you're working with a refugee, then they might add their refugee egg experience and status to the framework. And if you're working with an indigenous person, then they will add their indigenous egg experience to the framework because they are core fundamental parts of their identity. These new aspects are still just as important as any of the pre existing aspects in the model. Finally, the social graces framework makes the aspects of our identity explicit and visible. As a result of our identities and different aspects of it isn't often spoken about or given room to be discussed inside or outside the, the therapy room. This means the framework gives us a chance to discuss our thoughts on the unsaid aspect of our identity, in addition to the aspects that we wear on our sleeves. For example, some unsaid aspects of my identity generally include my thoughts on religion, my sexuality, my sexual orientation, my gender identity, amongst others. Whereas I'm happy to wear the age, generation, biological sex, education, amongst others, on my sleeve, so to say. On the whole, when in therapy sessions, social graces can be discussed with a client to get both the client and therapist thinking about how each aspect of identity impacts their thoughts and behaviors. For example, when a client and therapist talk about education, they can talk about how their education background influences their views. And when people talk about generation, they can talk about their lives growing up and how their attitudes and behaviors of different generations impact their views nowadays. If my granddad, who was born in the silent generation, was to discuss his generation, then he would talk about how you just didn't show emotion, you didn't show that you were upset, and you certainly didn't talk about your feelings or complain as part of that generation. Then a therapist would explore how those attitudes impact his daily life and behavior now, and whether these are still adaptive or maladaptive attitudes to have these days. What are the advantages of the social graces framework? Firstly, a great benefit of the social graces framework is that it helps us to see our own implicit biases, because when we examine the different aspects of our identities, this allows us to think about how they shape our actions and those about the self, others, and the world. Then, by talking about these aspects, we can eliminate or at least minimize implicit biases in our clinical practice. Secondly, the framework is great because it helps people to understand identity. And I would like to add that this is very useful as a potential psychoeducation tool for our clients because identity is a very abstract concept. So, by providing a framework to our clients that can help to facilitate a discussion, this is a really useful way of making an abstract concept slightly more tangible for our clients, as well as the framework is a useful way to examine with our clients how aspects of our identity impact of our beliefs and perspectives. Lastly, another advantage of the social graces framework is that it makes us talk about the invisible and unsaid aspects of the self. I mean, without this framework, we wouldn't talk about a lot of the different aspects of identity because most aspects are often overlooked or ignored because they're invisible. It's really common to talk about race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and education because we largely see these social factors. Yet, it is rare to talk about generation, sexuality, amongst others. This means it's useful that clients and psychologists can talk through each aspect one by one to make sure nothing is overlooked. What are the disadvantages of the social graces framework? So, the first major disadvantage of this framework is the very fact that it's a framework, not theory. This means that whilst it's a very useful tool for thinking about identity, this isn't a theory that offers us an explanation of how the world works. In other words, social graces should not be considered the same as a critical whiteness theory, critical race theory, or intersectional theory, because each of these valuable and insightful theories offers us an explanation for how the world works. In a said, the social graces framework only offers us a chance for important discussions to be had about social identity biases. So some people argue that the lack of explanation about the world is a disadvantage. In addition, a final disadvantage of the framework is that it completely fails to understand just how complex our identities are. At some point in the next year, I have a book coming out called Your Unshakable Self, and I'm really looking forward to that book being released because it explores a lot about how our sense of self, our identity, and all the different ways how it impacts our behaviour. This social graces framework doesn't cover the majority of what I talk about in this book, and another sub issue of the framework that it is the complete opposite of intersectional theory, according to Butler 2017. Intersectional theory sees that intersectional identities are unique, impossible to talk about separately, and you cannot neatly separate out our identities. Personally, I completely agree with Butler 2017 because if you talk about some aspects of my identity, you cannot talk about the sexuality part of my identity without talking about my sexual orientation, my gender identity, my biological sex, race, and my class. Since the very fact that I'm a gay non binary person assigned to male at birth who's white and young, who has very little romantic or sexual experience, fundamentally means that all these factors intersect and interact to form my views and perspective about myself, others, and the world. Equally, you cannot talk about me being a clinical psychology master's student, which is education, without considering how I'm white, from the south of England, from a nationally deprived area. All of those different social identities impact my educational journey and my views. Those are only some examples of how you can't treat aspects of identity separately. On the whole, Butler 2017 argued that breaking down our identity into separate categories fails to understand just how complex our identities are, as well as the framework seeks to look at identities as a sum of its parts, instead of an indivisible and holistic concept. Conclusion. So, after struggling for a few months to understand the social graces and what they actually were, because in my lectures the social grace framework was always just skipped over, I'm really happy that I took the time to think about social graces. They are flat out critical. We should be having these conversations, and we should be reflecting and always wanting to be fair. Having social graces doesn't make us a problem in society. People will always have social graces that others do not have, and vice versa. But if we do not reflect on our biases and think about how our social identities impact us, and if we do not become proactive in becoming fairer, then this is where social graces become a problem. We should always be striving to make society better, fairer, and more equal for everyone, regardless of their social graces. Ultimately, Birmingham and all gave us a very useful way of looking at how social identities impact our implicit biases, as well as this is a valuable discussion tool to help mental health practitioners think about how best we can counter our own biases so that we can achieve social justice. Everyone deserves to be treated fairer, compassionately, and equally in society, let alone our therapy rooms. So, if having discussions about social graces is the way to achieve these outcomes, then it is something we absolutely have to do. And you'll likely learn a lot of fun, interesting, and surprising things along the way. So, I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I did, because social graces is something that is likely to come up in my exam, because it's one tiny topic in the working clinically with old adult section of my exam. So it might come up, it might not. But even if it doesn't, I'm so glad that I learned this, because as a mental health practitioner going forward, I really want to understand this, and I want to acknowledge this too. And if you know anyone who will enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the words about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, then please check out Moral Psychology, an introduction to the social psychology, biological psychology, and applied psychology of morality, available in all of the usual places. And you can get the AI generated audiobook available from selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Overdrive, Biblioteca, and Baker & Taylor. And if you want to become a patron of the show, then please head on over to patreon.com/psychology podcast. Or if you want to share the podcast a bit of like one-time support, then please head on over to buymeacoffee.com/Con Wiley. So, have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.